Welcome back to another video. In this video we'll take a look at functions, what a function is and how we would create our own functions. From a high level perspective, a function is a block of code that performs a specific task, and functions help with writing less code. And what I mean here is a block of code belongs to the function. So rather than writing the same code again and again within the program, we just call the function every time we need it. If you have been following my Python video series, we've already used some of Python's built-in functions. For example, the print function for printing things to the console, and the input function for letting the user input something using the keyboard. Also, the length function to determine the number of items in an object, and the type function to determine the type of data we are using. For example, a data type list, or a set, float, integer, etc. Although technically speaking, the last two are referred to as methods because they are tied to an object. And behind the scenes, these functions are, again, blocks of code. We don't need to write these blocks of code each time we need them, as that's what the function is there for. We use the function instead. We can also pass parameters and arguments into the function inside the parenthesis. So we can see each function has an open and closed parenthesis straight after it. So we can also pass parameters and arguments into the function inside the parenthesis. Basically, parameters are placeholders defined for values that functions require, and arguments are values or information that we specify in place of that parameter. And by the way, I do have a dedicated video on this, so a dedicated video on parameters and arguments within functions. And one more important thing about functions, the function should already exist when you call the function. So it's best to place your functions at the top of the code. This means wherever you call the function within the code base, Python knows that the function already exists because it's already seen it at the top of your code. And now if you go to the official Python documentation, python.org, here is the link. Here are the other built-in functions that Python supports, so we can see all of them here. We have the input function here, and we have the print function here, the power of function, the absolute function over here, the length function over here, the range function, the round function. So these are all of the pre-built, predefined functions that come with Python itself, and you can read more about these on the official documentation. And this slide is on creating our own user-defined functions. So when we create a function, or when we define a function, we use the def keyword, which is used to define the function. So we start off with def, then we specify the function identifier, which is the name for the function. So you give the function a name to identify the function, and then a function ends with an open and closed parenthesis, and optionally parameters inside them, and a colon, which indicates the start of the function's block of code. And sometimes we need to return the result of the function back to the caller, and this is where we specify a return statement. Now, before we dive into PyCharm and start to create functions, in blue we can see a block of code to create VLANs from 1 to 10, and I may be using this multiple times in my program. So I'd rather create a function for it, and then I can call upon the function rather than repeating this block of code everywhere in my program. We are going to have a look at this one as an example in PyCharm, but just to have a look at how we would do this, here's the same block of code on the right hand side. Then we've got the def keyword to create the function, and then our name of the function, I've called it VLAN_ID. Then we've got the open and close parentheses followed by a colon. And then of course our block of code. That block of code should be tabbed. So the top line in red defines our function, and then wherever we need to call the function within our program, we specify the name of the function, which is VLAN_ID in my case, followed by the open and close parenthesis. Let's have a look at how this works in PyCharm. We are on PyCharm, and let's type in some code to gather the user's name and age, and then we will convert this into a function. First, let's run the file just to make sure it's running without any errors. So I did miss a comma. Enter your name. So I'll enter my name. And then age. So the program runs fine. I could have also done formatted string instead. And let's rerun the file again just to make sure it works, which it does. So now we can define it as a function, and to do that we type in def for define, and this function I want to call user_ID to gather the user ID for a user, open and closed parenthesis followed by a colon. Right, now we have to indent the code. so that Python knows it's part of the function. So now that's created the function, and our function is called user ID, and as usual a function has an open and close parenthesis. So let's run the file, and it doesn't actually run the file because we have to call the function. Now all this code is part of this function here. We've only defined the function, we have not called the function, so even the print function as part of this code is not going to be executed as it's part of the function itself. We need to call the function for any of its code to be executed. So the way we do that, just like the print function, user underscore ID, open and close parenthesis, and now let's run the file again, and there we go. So now it's running the code. So if I need this block of code again in my Python program, I just need to run the function, which is this here. So now let's start off with a clear screen, and let's create our VLAN example. So we have configured our code to create VLANs 1 to 10. Let's run the file to make sure the code runs, which it does. Now let's create it as a function. So again, def, let's call this one VLAN underscore ID, open and close parentheses, followed by colon, and let's indent everything. And that's it. So if we run the file now, it's not going to run the code because we need to call the function. Let's call the function VLAN underscore ID, and let's run the file again, and this time the file runs perfectly fine. And that's it for this video. That's how we create functions. So we can reuse code by calling the function.